Welcome. This session is to introduce you to the Green Book and to give you an update on the appraisal process. I'm Louise Halfpenny and I'm the Director of Communications, and I'd like to thank you very much for your time in watching this short presentation. What we intend to do today is to give feedback on the investment objectives and the critical success factors. And thank you again for your help with that project. We are also going to introduce you to the Green Book, which we've talked about before, but perhaps not explained in detail. And we're going to give you an overview of our long list process. Today, we have Helen Brown, our Deputy Chief Executive, and a new face for you, Dwayne Passman. Dwayne has over 3 decades of expertise in developing major projects, multi-million-pound projects, many of them hospitals. He likes his topic so much that he teaches it also, and he comes to us with fresh eyes, with no history, and we're very grateful to have him on board. You can see a structure here of how we are tackling this huge project and the various teams that are working with myself and Helen under Dwayne's leadership to really bring this to fruition. So lots of people there keeping themselves very busy as we have quite a challenging deadline. And I'm now going to hand over to Helen, and she is going to talk to you about the investment objectives and critical success factors.
Thank you, Louise. So we spent some time at the last session looking at the investment objectives and critical success factors. And I'm just going to recap now on what these are for and what we've done since the last session. So the investment objectives set out what we're aiming to achieve in the programme, and the critical success factors or essential criteria are used to support a high level evaluation of the long list and help us arrive at a short list to be considered in more detail. So critical success factors are kind of pass-fail factors that options on the long list need to pass in order to come through to the shortlist stage. You were asked to feed back on the draft investment objectives and critical success factors following our workshop in June, and we published all the feedback that we received on our website, and we are and I have updated both the investment objectives and the critical success factors following the feedback that we received and a bit of further work within the programme team. We will be taking these to our programme board meeting in August for final approval, and they will guide the board when it makes its decision around the shortlist later in the year. We have made some changes based on the feedback that we received, so I'm going to be talking you through those over the next couple of slides. And we're really very grateful for the time that people took to look at this and to give us their views, which was very helpful. So this is a summary snapshot on this slide of the feedback that we received, and I'll just pause for a moment so you can take a quick look at that. And note that a summary of the key points that we received to question 3, so the more narrative elements, has been already provided with our responses to that feedback. So before I bring you back up to the revised investment objectives and critical success factors, I just wanted to take a step back and say something about the scope and ambition of the programme. And this is something that we've debated over the past few years, and particularly in 2019, when we were set a very tough challenge to come up with an option at around £350 million. But if we take a step back from that and what I've called the do everything, if the scope and ambition of this programme was all of our services on all of our sites, reaching standard A for both condition and suitability, with a 60-year building life and enough capacity for growth to 2055, that effectively means you're talking about 100% new build for all of our current provision, and the cost would be upward of £1 billion. So we don't believe that is affordable, and we don't believe that we would get the funding through the Department of Health and the Treasury for that scale of investment. So the investment objectives and the work that we've done thinking about scope and investment objectives are really trying to tease out what we think the priority must-haves are from this investment. So unpacking that a little bit under the do something, our view is that emergency care services are the highest priority for investment. That was very much the outcome of the work in 2019, when we had to think about what we would really do, and the case for investing in emergency care services is very strong, linked to both the nature of the clinical needs of patients coming through for emergency care, the volume of services, and particularly also the condition of the buildings on the Watford General Hospital site. So take those things together, and that's why we believe that emergency care services are the highest priority. We've set minimum condition B and suitability B and a 30-year life, which doesn't mean that in our preferred way forward, when we get to that point, there won't be elements that are condition A, suitability B, A and 60-year life, and anything that is new build will be condition A, suitability A and 60-year life. We're just at this stage in the investment objective saying that as a minimum, we want to get all of our clinical services into that minimum condition B, suitability B and 30-year life. We want to have capacity, we want to plan and build now for sufficient capacity to 2035 and have flexibility to expand in the future. And we believe that we should be aiming to deliver this by 2025 or 2026 at the latest. Now, that is quite an ambitious timeline. It's a timeline that all of the HIP1 hospitals are working to, but it's also a timeline that we very strongly support, because we believe there is an urgent need to make these improvements to our emergency care estate. In terms of the expected capital under the do something options, as people will know because we've talked about this previously, we originally in 2019 looked at an option that would cost approximately £300 million to make those improvements at Watford to emergency care. And over recent months, we've been talking to NHS England and the Department of Health about the potential to increase that financial capital availability for emergency care up to approximately £550 million. But that is subject to the business case demonstrating value for money and that it's the most economically advantageous option, which we will talk more about in future sessions, and obviously subject to Treasury approval. But that will give you a feel of the potential cost of options for emergency care. For planned care, services currently delivered at Hemel Hempstead and Satch, we're looking in this phase of investment at essential investment only to support service provision, address the poorest condition estate and enable the Hemel Hempstead site in particular to be rationalised, because we know that there are lots of buildings on that site that are either not used at all or in very poor condition, and there's an opportunity to consolidate services, to build some new and then release some of the land at Hemel for redevelopment as part of the Hemel Hempstead Town Centre redevelopment. We're saying for planned care a minimum 15-year life, and that is with the expectation that at some point in the future, but not in this phase of investment, we would need to make a further investment into planned care services to make them sustainable for the long term. The expected capital available is approximately £50 million, and I will talk a bit more about that a few slides later on. I've just referenced here at the bottom of the slide business as usual and do minimum options. So you are required to have a business as usual option within the business case, which acts as a comparator against which you test the value of any investment you're making. That is effectively just essential backlog maintenance and essential additional capacity required to sustain services. And the do minimum is a requirement that you look at what's the least capital investment you can make to meet your key investment objectives. And effectively for this business case, that will be the option from the 2019 stock, or that's what we expect it to be. So moving on and looking in a bit more detail, what you've got on this slide is the investment objectives. You can see we've got red and green text here and little yellow highlights. This shows where we've made changes based on the feedback received. So we received feedback about being clearer about improved patient and staff experience. That was included in the earlier draft, but I completely agree it didn't stand out as much as it should have done. So we've pulled that right to the top of the list, and that's what this is all about. The other changes we've made relate to being explicit about meeting growth in demand, recognising that change now from 2055 to 2035, which is actually a little bit in the detail of how we've done the technical modelling. But until 2035, we are modelling growth in population, change in demand due to changes in clinical practice and transformation. And from 2035 onwards, those two things are expected to balance out. But more importantly, as we look to the future, we need to build flexibility, and that is also now reflected into the critical success factors. I think that's everything I want to say on that slide. I'm sure you will want to come back and take another look at this, and we will publish these amended investment objectives and critical success factors so that you can look at them in detail. The next slide looks at the critical success factors, and again the same thing where we've made changes. You can see those using the track changes. We have made a change based on the feedback we received to critical success factor 3, recognising that we want to see an improvement in quality and safety from current levels, not just maintaining safety. And we've also made some changes to critical success factor 7 around deliverability, noted the importance of providing flexibility for the future, and that links back to what I was just talking about in terms of capacity, and also the importance of being able to deliver the improvements by 2025-26 and to not be subject to significant planning or delivery risk. So those are the changes we've made to the investment objectives and critical success factors. And I'm now going to hand over to Dwayne, who's going to talk you through the Treasury Green Book and business case guidance.
Thank you very much, Helen. And as Louise said in her very kind introduction, I'm a new face to Team West Herts. I've been in the trust now just for a few weeks. And as Louise outlined, my career has been spent on the development of major hospital programmes and projects across the UK. And I've also spent time as a regulator. So not only have I written business cases, but I've also marked other people's homework during that period of time. So I'm very, very familiar with the principles and toolkits that are available to us, which guide us through the process so that we can make rational and informed decisions. So the outline business case has to meet all the requirements that are set out in the Green Book guidance as to how we put together the overall appraisal for any investment proposal. And in government, that doesn't just mean major capital projects, but it's also policy development. It might be things like benefit and taxation spending. Also, the Green Book is applied to those as well. So there's a consistent framework across the whole of government as to how major decisions are made. And the Green Book also, by providing that very, very clear framework for us, ensures that there is a consistency across government. So all the other hospital projects are applying the Green Book in the same way, so that there is a consistency in approach, as I said, to arriving at a shortlist and then a preferred option to be then taken forward for approval and further development. And this isn't a mechanical process. It's open, it's transparent, and it provides, and the Green Book provides best practice for us to apply to that decision making and the inputs that we are putting into it. So essentially there are 3 stages to investment appraisal in developing business cases. So the strategic outline case is really, where are we now and where are we going? So it's establishing a case for change and a preferred option or a preferred way forward identified to inform the next stages and also to inform the approvals at higher level. At outline business case, that's really what are we going to do? It's identifying the preferred option against the critical success factors and investment objectives to a long list and a short list of options. And then at the end of that process, by filtering the options through that robust and transparent process to arrive at a full business case, which is the final step in the process before we start construction, which is really the how are we going to do it? So how in detail are we going to build those new facilities? How are we going to staff them? And how will models of care and services be provided within them that gives the best benefit for patients, staff and visitors? This just is another overview of the process, which illustrates diagrammatically what I've just been describing. So we're looking at a long list at the moment to inform the outline business case in 5 particular areas. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment. But what we bring to each of those options that we're looking at is a clinical model. So how we're trying to develop services in emergency care and planned care across our hospital sites. What are our investment objectives, as Helen's just set out? Do we have any constraints? Are there things that are going to mean that there's certain of those long list of options that we won't be able to undertake in a deliverable way? And whether there are dependencies between options. So if we do one thing in advance of another thing, does that mean that we're constraining ourselves against that wider view of options? We're using, as Helen said, the critical success factors to pass and fail in that long list. And that should bring us down to a manageable and deliverable set of options, which we can then examine in more detail. And the Treasury Green Book says that we do need to look at business as usual and do minimum, as Helen's just outlined, but also with a list of other options that provides us with the opportunity to examine quite widely what the economic and non-economic benefits of each of those options are. And the box in the top right-hand corner of the slide talks about the economic benefits. So it's looking at things like clinical benefits. Those might be if there is improved survival rates for patients or improved treatment rates and treatment times for patients, which will mean that they get treated earlier and can then take up their normal lives much quicker. And that will have an economic cost to it. So for example, if someone requires a hip replacement, say, then if they can have that done quickly and simply, that will mean that they can go back to their normal lives, and if they're employed, to go back into work and generate an economic benefit to society. It's not necessarily something you can attach a pound sign to in terms of writing a check or handing over your credit card, but it is a wider benefit to society of people being economically active in work and generating benefits for the economy in terms of taxes, in terms of their purchasing power at local shops and things like that. So that's the economic side of the equation. On the other side, there will be the non-economic things. So it's things that we can't really easily quantify, but we can take a more qualitative approach to them. So we're looking at the quality aspects of each of the options there. And it's by mixing together the economic and non-economic benefits, we can measure all of the options and their costs and benefits in a rational framework. And essentially, at the end of that process, whatever has the highest ratio of non-economic to economic benefits against cost, that will help us guide ourselves towards a preferred option upon which a decision can be made. So the key steps in this process, steps 1 and 2, Helen has talked about and have been the subject of other sessions for the SRG. This gives us options 3 and 4, and that's what we've been covering in the presentation today. We will come back to options 5 and 6 in a future presentation. So that's really how we're using the options framework and how we're using the critical success factors and investment objectives to apply to a relatively short list of options for more detailed development, and ensuring that we can track through all the benefits for each of those options and what all the detailed costs are as well. So looking at the long list framework, we're looking across pretty much 5 different things. So scope, service solution, service delivery, implementation, and funding. So scope being the what, so how big is the project? What are we trying to do? The service solution, how in terms of delivering the preferred scope for the project, can we best achieve that scope? The who, so who might we partner with to undertake the construction phase of the process, or to provide our hospitals with better functionality in terms of digital and IT. Implementation, so the when, so how are we going to do it and in what timescale, and the funding, how much, and how would we draw that down from government over time. Now, that's a fairly objective run through of how the Green Book works, and I'd like to hand back to Helen, please, for her to be able to describe what that means for the acute hospital redevelopment across West Herts.
Thanks, Dwayne. So yes, I'm just going to talk you through the right-hand column, some of which I've already touched on earlier. But for scope for West Hertfordshire, we've defined this as the scope of acute services for which the facilities will be required. And in a minute, I'm going to bring this even more to life for you. For service solution, we've split this into 2 different aspects. So the site from which the acute services will be provided, and the quality or lifetime of facilities to be provided for those services. In terms of service delivery, this is about construction, design and build and running of services. But effectively, we're assuming that all clinical services will be delivered by the NHS, and that we will partner with specialist organisations to deliver the build and the running of the facilities. In terms of implementation, we've defined this as the implementation approach for the required work, and you'll see how we've defined the options there. And then funding, this is the source of capital investment necessary to undertake the required works. So I'm going to move on to what we call the long list generator, and we've split this into 2. So we've got a long list generator for emergency care and a second one for planned care, because although they are linked, they are also 2 distinctly different and separate decisions and investments to be made. So just bringing back, so we talked before about scope for emergency care, and our definition of that being around the clinical services, acute clinical services to be delivered. And we've framed 3 different options on this, which is we could focus just on core emergency services, so the A&E department, resuscitation facilities, critical care theatres that are absolutely core to delivery of emergency care. Our second option on this list is the core emergency services that I've described, but also associated clinical dependencies and adjacencies. So for example, you do maternity and children's services do need to be on the same site as your emergency care services. And so the second option here includes all of those services as well. And the third option for scope is all clinical and non-clinical services required on the emergency and specialist care site. So 3 different choices that we've got to make in terms of the scope of this investment, from keeping it really quite tight and defined on the core emergency services to actually encompassing all of the services currently delivered on the Watford site. Under service solution, as I said previously, we've split this into 2. So the Green Book just gives it as 1, but we've determined 2 dimensions here. The first one being the site from which services could be provided. So this should hopefully be straightforward, either Watford, St Albans, Hemel Hempstead, or a greenfield site. And in terms of quality and lifetime, we've talked about this a bit when we were talking about investment objectives and critical success factors, but either business as usual, so just the backlog maintenance, or a 15, 30 or 60 year lifetime across the estate. In terms of service delivery, who's best placed to do this? Well, the Trust could deliver it itself. We could partner with a single private sector organisation using a framework, or we could work with multiple private sector providers. In terms of implementation, we've just split this into 2, which is either one kind of what we've called big bang build, so a focused, time limited, you start and you stop in the shortest period of time that you can, versus a phased build which takes place over a longer period of time. And then finally, in terms of funding, there are 3 funding source options that we've put there: public dividend capital, which is Treasury funded, Treasury funding for the public sector; mixed funding option, which is public dividend capital but supplemented by other funding sources, such as Section 106 planning contributions, or using private finance for equipment replacement; and then finally a private finance option. Now, it's important to note in this long list generator that you cannot read from horizontally from left to right. You can only read these options vertically, and the way the Green Book asks you to do this is then to look at each of those and assess each dimension against your critical success factors, and then you bring all of that together, and that helps you be clear about what your short list of options are. So this is a new way of doing the long list to short list. We didn't use it in our previous SOCs, but this is the approach that is recommended in the Green Book, and important that we do use this approach for the outline business case, and the regulators and people who will need to approve our business case will expect us to use this framework. Although within this, now you might be looking at this and thinking that some of it slightly contradicts what I've said earlier, and you're right to a degree, because this long list generator is a framework for teasing out things like investment objectives and scope. It isn't a linear process where you do one and then the other. You use these tools to help you tease out what are the really important things and what are the options you could deliver. The other thing to note with this is that although we've included private finance in our funding options, it is clear that government policy at the moment is not to use private finance for NHS capital investments. So we don't expect in reality that private finance is an option, but for completeness we have shown it there. So we've taken a similar approach for planned care. I won't go through it in the same level of detail because I'm sure you've got the hang of this now, but we've defined 3 different levels of service scope with different proportions of the current services included within the scope. We've looked at the sites, and again it's slightly different, and we have included options which consolidate services to St Albans and Hemel, or maintain them on both sites. Sorry, I've got a visitor from a cat now. In terms of quality lifetime, the same options that we framed for emergency care. For service delivery, the same way, and in fact service implementation and funding remain the same, and the same comments that I made previously apply. You cannot read this left to right, you can only read each column in its own right. So I know that it's quite hard to use this framework and then say, well, what are they actually talking about in terms of long list options? So the next slides hopefully make that translation a bit for you. So potentially, and I do want to emphasize that this slide is only indicative, and particularly the capital costs and the percentages that are on this slide are supposed to be illustrative. But what you can see that you've got a range of options, starting on the left with option 1, which is the business as usual, which in the 2019 SOC we had costed at approximately £75 million, all the way through to option 7, which is a new hospital on a new site, clearly 100% new build, and the costs for 100% new build on a new site for emergency care services we would expect to be towards the 650, 700, potentially even 750 million pounds. And then between those two extremes, you've got a range of options for redeveloping emergency care services on the Watford General Hospital site, with option 2 being the 2019 SOC option. And I've described there in the bottom left-hand corner just a recap of what that included: a large new clinical block with theatres, critical care, maternity, paediatrics, neonatal, and acute assessment and acute inpatient beds, with a refurbishment of the Princess Michael of Kent main clinical block to address some of the key issues there and make some improvements to the inpatient wards. And then as you work your way towards through option 3, 4, 5 and 6, they are all really enhanced versions where we're spending more capital to make bigger improvements at Watford and effectively increasing the proportion of new build. So option 4 is the first option that's costed to allow for a full replacement of the PMOK block, and option 5 looks at some of the other clinical services distributed across the site, and we are still working through what the detail of those options might be. But I hope that that then brings to life the options generator into the options, but it will be an assessment of the options generator which then determines which of these broad options we take forward. And the team, the design team, the estates team in particular, working with the clinical work stream, then get into the detail of saying, okay, broadly, we've identified this option. What does that look like in detail? So moving on to the planned care options, these are effectively the same options. We framed this in the same way that we had framed it in 2019 when we were looking at options. So these should be familiar to people, hopefully most people who were involved before. Business as usual option, the SOC option in 2019, which saw approximately £50 million of investment on the Hemel and St Albans sites, and then various options where more was invested in planned care, either on both sites or on either the Satch site or the Hemel Hempstead site. So we reduced from 2 sites to 1 for planned care services. And option 6, which was the new single site planned care hospital on a new site for our catchment population, which is obviously then 100% new build and a significantly higher capital cost. Now, as I've already said, this is the same work and framework that we used in 2019, and the capital costs haven't been updated, so all of the numbers that I've used today are based on 2019 costs, and they are all indicative at this stage, and they will all be updated as we move in to shortlist stage. But the detailed work comes only on the short list of options, not on the long list. I think it's important to say here under planned care that while you'll be aware that we've had some discussions with our regulators about potential increase to the capital funding available to us for West Hertfordshire, that has focused on emergency care, and there is no there's no change effectively in the indicative capital available for planned care, which is expected to be approximately £50 million. So although I've put these long list options up here, our expectation is, in terms of the investment objectives and meeting the critical success factors using that long list generator, that we will be looking, we won't be looking at the options that cost significantly more than £50 million. And that goes back to what I said earlier about emergency care being the priority for this phase of investment. It doesn't mean that we don't want to see more significant investment in planned care for our population in due course, but in terms of this investment and the immediate priorities, we need to focus on emergency care, and we'll be looking to limit the investment on the other two sites to the things that are essential for the next 15 years. So that is, I know this is complex. It is quite tricky to understand, because this isn't, as I've already said, a completely linear process where you go A, B, C, D, E. This is a little bit more iterative than that, but it is a framework, as Dwayne's described, that's intended to help you narrow down a really wide range of potential options to a much smaller targeted list of options that you then do a really detailed appraisal on. And it's intended to help you be clear about what your absolute priorities are and what choices you've got in terms of how you deliver against those. So I'm now going to hand back to Dwayne, who's going to talk about what happens next.
Thank you, Helen. So the first thing, as I hinted at when I was talking about the Green Book, is to look at those long list of options from the generator that Helen's just detailed, and to make an assessment, a RAG rating, red, amber, green rating for each one of those options. So red if it fails to meet either an investment objective or a critical success factor, green if it very clearly does, or amber if it does in part. So this helps us rule out, in that initial sift from all those options which don't very, very clearly meet the investment objectives and critical success factors. And eventually that will be used to identify a preferred way forward. Now the team, both in terms of the team at the Trust, our partners at Royal Free Property Services and our advisory colleagues, are collating evidence to support that initial assessment. And one of the key things that will be an input into that will be a report called the Site Survey, which will be used to determine the availability or deliverability of new site options versus those at Watford as well. And we will be making that publicly available during this process. Now that assessment of how we move from long list to short list and then beyond will be undertaken by the programme team from the Trust, and with input from our regional colleagues and their estates advisors, and also representation from Health Watch to ensure that we have a patient voice in that decision-making process. We will share the inputs and outputs with all stakeholders and provide an opportunity for comment on what we've been going through for that first part of the process, and we'll be doing that in early September. Now, the proposed shortlist and the preferred way forward will be presented for approval by the joint boards of West Hertfordshire Hospitals Trust and Herts Valley Clinical Commissioning Group on the 1st of October at a joint public board meeting. Now that will also be presented with a summary of all the feedback that we've received to date and during this process, which those boards will take into account in their decision making. We'll then be able to start detailed work on defining and appraising those short list of options, so looking in real detail at what the costs of each option is and what the benefits of each option is. And simply put, we'll end up at a point where we'll find, say, 80% of the benefits that we want when we've valued those could be paid for by £1, and that might represent value for money. However, 100% of those benefits by value can only be bought for £2 of expenditure. And you can see the differential between those two, £1 to get to 80% of all the benefits versus £2 to get to 100% of the benefits. The £2 to get to 100% of the benefits would not be seen to be value for money by the Treasury. And that's how that process works in getting us to the optimal balance between cost and benefit, and therefore selecting a preferred option. And that's what we will be undertaking next.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dwayne. Thank you, Helen. Not very much for me to add, but if you do have any room for any more information, please keep checking back onto our website. We've got FAQs there, working on the next set already. And again, thank you very much for your time. This is an absolutely critical part of our appraisal process. So thank you for joining us and learning more about it.